Hello, and welcome to the Feedback That Matters, Best Practices for High Quality Peer Review. My name is Angela Hoffman Cooper, and I use she and her pronouns. I'm the Director of Conference and Events with ASHE, the Association for the Study of Higher Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be here and learn more about our peer review process. Today's webinar has closed captioning enabled using Zoom AI. You can select the CC or closed captioning icon on the bottom of your screen for those captions to display. This may be tucked under the More option on the bottom of your Zoom menu, depending on the size of your Zoom window. This session is also being recorded. If you are joining us after this event and you're viewing this recording on YouTube, you may select the CC icon on YouTube for captioning. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I'm joining you from in virtual community today. I'm joining with you today from the Anishinaabe homelands and ceded territory established by the Treaty of 1842. The Keweenaw Bay region is home to the Keweenaw Bay Indian community, located adjacent to Lake Superior, or Gitchagami, in today what is known as the northernmost parts of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I acknowledge and respect the many Indigenous people, past and present, connected to this land, and understand that my actions in this space and community have an impact on the people, land, and waters of this area. I invite us each to reflect on the history and enduring presence of the land and people we are in relationship with as we tune in from our respective locations. I'd also like to share my enthusiasm for today's session. The session is brought to you by the ASHE 2023 Program Committee, and today Drs. Angela Boatman and Gerardo Blanco, the ASHE 2023 Program Committee co-chairs, will be in conversation with some of our esteemed panelists from the 2023 ASHE Conference Committee about promising practices for high-quality peer review. At the end of today's session, I will close out with logistics about how to access your reviews in the conference portal and information about completing reviews. We are using the Zoom webinar platform for today's discussion. You are welcome to introduce yourself in the chat, let us know where you're joining from and what you are excited about being a reviewer and whether or not it's your first time, any additional information you'd like to share. We also will be keeping an eye to the questions and answers, either incorporating those into our panel discussion as we are able, or I'll be chatting back answers to you while our panelists are discussing. The ASHE staff, as I mentioned, are here behind the scenes to assist you should you have any questions for us or need any support with your experience during the webinar. You're welcome to send me a private chat here in Zoom, or you can send me an email, and I'll be sure to put my email address in the chat for you here in just a moment. We also have our virtual events code of conduct, as ASHE is committed to providing a safe, productive, and welcoming environment for our event participants. More information will be available at a link I will also drop in the chat here in a second. With that, I am really excited for today's discussion, and I hope you are too. I'm excited to learn from our esteemed moderators and panelists, and want to thank you once again for taking the time to join us. With that, I will turn it over to our program committee co-chairs, Angela Boatman and Gerardo Blanco, to take us forward today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Angela. One Angela to another. So nice to have all of you here with us. I really want to thank our panelists especially for taking the time out on a Friday afternoon. I'm Angela Boatman. I am one of the two co-chairs of this year's ASHE Program Committee, and I'm an associate professor of higher education at Boston College. My pronouns are she, her, and I am going to kick it over to my colleague, Gerardo, who is just 2 doors down from me in his office right now.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you. Warm greetings from the land of the Moswatuset and Wampanoag peoples. And it's just absolutely a delight to learn from my colleagues in this panel about their perspectives on feedback that matters. But as you will notice, a lot of this is about the relationships that we build with each other. So there are 2 main parts to our session. We will spend the first part of our time together learning from our colleagues who are part of this distinguished panel about some of the practices that they employ in providing feedback that is moving our field forward, in addition, of course, to the very important roles that they serve in the conference committee. And also the second part, we will turn it over back to Angela Hoffman-Cooper, who will then provide us some very valuable information about how to actually provide this feedback in the online system that we utilize. So I'll turn it over again to Angela to facilitate the introductions of our panelists today.
Yes, we are so grateful for our 4 panelists today, all of whom we identified as extraordinary reviewers, both for the quality of reviews, but also just the thoughtfulness that these 4 people have put into reviews over the past 4 years, or many years for ASHE. And so we wanted to first have them introduce themselves, and then we will get into some of the questions that we've received about reviews. So Cheryl, do you mind starting us off?
Sure. Thank you, Angela Gerardo, Angela the 2 Angelas for hosting us today. So good afternoon, everyone, for those of you who are on the East Coast. So my name is Cheryl Chang, she, her pronouns. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I reside in what is currently known as Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is the original home of the Massachusetts people. I've been, I guess, like ever since grad school, I've been like reviewing for ASHE. So maybe between 8-10 years now. I might have taken a year off here or there, but fairly consistent. And it's, you know, ASHE is has been a really wonderful home for me. And so that is the reason why I continue to do reviewing and various other things. I'm going to pass it to next to Kat.
Hi, thank you. So happy to be here this afternoon with all of you. Again, my name is Kat Stevens-Peace, pronoun she, her, hers. I'm a visiting assistant professor at Allegheny College and a diversity teaching fellow as well. I'm also in their community and justice studies program. I am on the inaugural conference committee leadership team this year for ASHE's conference in November. And I'm one of 4 co-chairs on the accessibility committee, so I'm happy to rep the committee. And I think this is maybe my 4th year, perhaps, as a reviewer. So I'm happy to be here doing this good work with all of you today. And I'll pass it all to Paul.
Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Rubin. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy at the University of Utah. I'm joining from Salt Lake City, which is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. Similar to Cheryl, I think this is about maybe my 9th year, maybe 10th year, something like that, of reviewing for ASHE. I'm this year the format co-chair for the new format of posters and works in progress. So I will love to share some thoughts on that today. Yeah, very excited for the conversation today. Vermont.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. Very excited to be here. Roman Liera, pronouns he, him, his. I'm an assistant professor at Montclair State University. This year, I am co-chair of the faculty, administrative, and staff section. Mouthful, but it's very, very descriptive. And then I think I've been reviewing similar to Cheryl and Paul. When I was texting Cheryl, like, I don't know how many years I've been reviewing for ASHE, but it's in many different aspects. So very excited just to be invited to share the things that I learned, but also as someone who submits to ASHE on a yearly basis, the things that I appreciate from reviewers as well. So I'll try to do it from both a reviewer, but also from someone who's received really good feedback as well. So very excited to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And so exciting to see those of you introducing yourselves in the chat that we have lots of first-time reviewers here today. So that's really exciting. You definitely are in for a treat to learn from some of our expert reviewers here today. So we want to thank everybody. If you submitted a question, or for those of you that put in questions when you registered for this webinar, we've taken a look across all of those questions and tried to put together some kind of big overarching questions that we thought might speak to different parts of some of the questions that were submitted. So we're going to, Gerardo and I are going to kick it off with a few questions for our panelists. But of course, feel free to also use the chat if you don't feel like any part of your particular questions are being answered or have been answered. So please do put those in the chat. But I'm going to get us started with a question for the 4 of you. In giving feedback on ASHE proposals, how do you approach feedback thinking about this in sort of in a humanizing way that supports the growth of the author? As you are thinking about the comments and the feedback that you're giving, How are your thoughts centered on development and helping to humanize that feedback for others?
So I can get us started. I think for
Awesome.
me, the first and foremost is recognizing that having gone through the other side of this and submitted the said proposal, recognizing that you have 2,000 words, right? Or if you submitted other formats, it could be less. I think one of the tricky things is, thinking through that there's 2,000 words, you're not going to be able to say everything that you'd be able to say in a 30+ page manuscript. But it's partially the question of promise. What is the project framed as? Did the author or authors portray that they have like a narrative of what they're doing and where they're going? I think those are all very critical components to it. I would say the other key thing, and this tends to be something that my advisor, colleagues, et cetera, had always mentioned to me, is before you render any feedback or start writing your feedback, read the whole thing. I know that sounds like super basic, but oftentimes you end up immediately jumping to a conclusion within the first paragraph, and they address all of your concerns in the 3 paragraphs later. And so in so many ways, I think that is always my first piece of advice, is read the entire thing, recognizing they have 2,000 words, and then go with that to think through if they've used those 2,000 words to the best of their ability.
So if I can jump in, I actually want to follow up with that. So I think it's really important to also remember that you are, at least when I review, I want to make sure to look at how can I accept this work? What is in the work that makes me really want to lean towards accepting versus reading from a framework of looking to reject a piece of work. So that's also important in the way that I'm setting myself up to read and be introduced to the work as well. And then when I think about accessibility a little bit more, I also think about how do we consider multiply marginalized folks in the work, and whatever our assumptions may be about their mental, physical, or emotional well-being when they're writing the work, submitting it, and also getting feedback from us as well. We should definitely consider that and consider potential latent ableism as we're continuing to read work, and any kind of opinions that we may have around excellence or rigor or scholarship in evaluating. So these are also things to consider in humanizing folks and supporting their growth as we review their work.
Yes, Roman.
Yes, thank you. Just building on the really good feedback. When I was starting to review for just in general, right, but especially including now for like ASHE proposals specifically, one of the things that I really caught myself doing in terms of like reactions that if I'm not careful to like stop, pause, and reflect, it's kind of like the influence of my training where I got my PhD, right? Like really questioning, like, what do I consider like rigorous, or what do I consider good, or even the question of what do I consider promising research, right, or proposals in this case, right? So I think being very intentional that all of this is very subjective, right? Yes, we do have a rubric, but how you react, it's extremely subjective based on your training. So I would say for me, I always try to be intentional to like not only read the entire proposal, but making like kind of like take like a step back mentally and kind of reflect like my overall reactions and why, like justify why am I reacting to this and what in the text itself is kind of like justifying the feedback, right? In addition to like being as constructive as possible as I can be, right? Acknowledging folks. So I would just add that one piece based on my own experience as a reviewer.
Yeah, if I
Thank you.
can, if I can just jump in really quickly, and I think it's really kind of echoing what some people have said, but maybe just like offering like a little different language. Like I like to like think about the proposals, and frankly, like any piece of writing, like even after you submit to, let's say, to a journal, which is kind of like further down the trajectory and it gets accepted, like even that remains a work in progress, right? It's about kind of, if you think about as researchers, we have like a really long trajectory. We rewrite our own work, we critique our own work. And so kind of like with that, even that in mind, even when something feels final, it's always a work in progress. And I think especially so like when projects get submitted for ASHE, I know we have a works in progress section, which is the poster, and that's kind of formally aligned as that. But I even think like papers that we submit, like they're sort of like early drafts, like we're an association that really welcomes like the conference to be a thinking space, which is different from other fields and disciplines. So there's no expectation that it's final. So I think I think that's always good to keep in mind when reviewing, and I think that kind of puts in, like, it sort of like keeps in place that, you know, we're all kind of on a journey together with whatever project we currently have. So the works in progress thing has been really a sort of like useful heuristic for me, just to remind myself to guard against like trying to be so quote unquote rigorous and based on what criteria, like I'm defining merit around a particular proposal.
Thank you all for these very valuable perspectives, which in fact kind of segue perfectly to the next question, which has to do with some of the experiences that we've had in recognizing that part of the peer review is that we are on both ends, on the offering and receiving feedback. And in that sense, how have reviews pushed your work forward? But also to what extent and in what ways have you found or encountered feedback that was not helpful? So thinking of the positive and negative experiences, which I think we all have had a combination of those. And I think some of those examples can be really valuable for those of us who are really looking to develop these skills, that we continue working on that ability. So Cheryl, I don't know if in fact I could return to you to start with this question.
Sure, happy to. So I think for me, I know you have to, like in reviews, you have to give this number, like there's a kind of rubric that's associated with the number. And then there's the qualitative feedback, like the written feedback. I mean, honestly, for me, I think I've never really found the numbers that useful. So I would say I would lean into providing like the qualitative, like written feedback. And then of course, within that, there are things that are useful and there are things that are much less useful. But I think what is important is that I think just kind of thinking about the numeric and the qualitative feedback together, there should be some kind of coherence and and you know, between the two in alignment. So you like don't give a 3, but your qualitative feedback is like, this is excellent. Like that's just weird. I mean, to receive that is just strange. So I'm like, what would be a 5 then? If this is excellent. So I think that's probably as much as I'll say about like the numeric feedback, but in terms of like the qualitative feedback, I think, I guess like building off the idea of, you know, what I just said about proposals being works in progress, is that I always find like, you know, questions are really useful. But again, questioning could feel like you're, you know, that you're potentially undercutting an idea. So I don't think questions that question the premise like of a project are ever really that useful, whatever you happen to think about the merit of that project. You know, keep that inside, you know, put that on a sticky note, but that doesn't necessarily make it into the review. I think questions that help, that kind of show that you're trying to think with them, you know, questions that, you know, if things are not clear, just say, you know, I'd love to see more detail around the analysis or your literature review, and you know that's going to happen in a 30-page paper. So I forget who mentioned amongst the panel, it's like, it's only 2,000 words, you can only have so much. But I think even recognizing that there's a limited space, but your question just would signal then to the author that actually that might be, you know, in writing the full paper, I'm like, okay, I'll have to go into some analytic detail, or I'd have to like talk a little bit more about my sample, or I'd have to talk more about my findings. So you can kind of think of also the questions are kind of prompts for, you know, the writing of the full paper, and just things that you just want to kind of, you know, clear up. I do think it's okay to offer critique, to be critical, but again, like not in a way that will invalidate or somehow undercut like the research questions or the premise like of the project altogether. I mean, no one wants to see a review that you've spent some time on this application, to Ramon's point. It's like, and then someone's just telling you there's no merit like in this project. It's like, you know, you're not going to feel super good about it. And so, you know, maybe you should also think about what kind of review would you like to receive, and like what would be helpful. And then of course, like if you happen to know specific pieces of literature or analytic methods that could be useful. I mean, I think those are always really welcomed and can point folks into, into fruitful directions.
Thank you very much, Paul. Could we go with you next?
Yeah, so one thing that I just wanted to add on that to Cheryl's comment. So I agree that I think the qualitative feedback is many moons more helpful than the numeric. However, I also know that I am super type A and I want to know what a number means. So generally speaking, what I think, and I double checked because on the ASHE reviewer resource website, they have a couple of examples of like super helpful and not so helpful feedback. They have a comment on that says that you should tune an accepted proposal to at least a 4. And I think that's something to keep in mind, right? So like a 4 or a 5 in theory is something that you as a reviewer believe should be accepted. 3 is on average-ish, and 2 and 1 is not. I think that for me is a very helpful metric to think back to Cheryl's comment, because I think the key for me, and I would say the most discouraging or unhelpful review are the ones where the numbers and the comments just make absolutely no sense together. Because that also then becomes the question of, what did we all collectively just not understand where these numbers went? So that was just my one little add-on.
Thank you very much. Kat, would you like to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. I will come from a different, little bit of an angle. I think some of my most helpful feedback was for a proposal that was not accepted. And I was able to really sit with it and turn it around and think about what I could do, how I could, what was of merit in the responses that I received, and how I could turn that back around. And for that example, I actually submitted it again the next year, and it was accepted. And so I made some adjustments. And so sometimes you don't get the exact response that you want immediately, but there is something useful, and you can sit with it and really see what you can use and see how you might, shape your work a little bit differently. So for me, sometimes that immediate not getting accepted is not necessarily a complete write-off altogether.
I
Thank
love
you.
that growth mindset. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all for that.
Yeah, I love these comments because I think they're nicely illustrating a key objective or goal of being a reviewer, which is to help the author to improve their work or to think about their work perhaps differently with your questions. And, to Cheryl's point earlier, not to change course, not to necessarily, critique the core idea of the work, but also how to help move it forward. And I wanted to ask you if you had any thoughts about this role of the reviewer and how you see the role as being able to help generate like a sense of belonging or community for the author in our ASHE community here. Like when you think about your role as reviewer, are you thinking about your comments in a way that's considering how to kind of bring someone into the ASHE community or even just the higher ed community at large? Ramon, do you mind if we start with you?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate this question so much because I think one thing that reviewing has really taught me is being mindful that when you get a review, I mean, you don't know who it's coming from, right? And I think as a reviewer, I don't think our role is to try to like decipher like, oh, this belongs to an advanced faculty or this belongs to a graduate student, right? Based on what we're assuming is the writing or the development of ideas, right? So I think with that in mind, I always keep that in mind to be treated as this is my colleague, right? Someone who is sharing their ideas, their papers, posters, and then treated in that sense to provide constructive feedback, right? I think a couple of things that I think about is like highlighting, and I think one thing in terms of like contextualize what I'm going to say is that there's different, as you can see, there's different sections, right? So as someone who's going to submit, I'm very intentional to say, okay, if I'm studying faculty, maybe I'm going to submit it to this section on faculty, administrative staff. Because the assumption right there is that the folks who are co-chairing are familiar with these areas, and the people who participate or volunteer to review are also familiar more or less with these same areas, right? I think I bring that up because I think it's important in terms of topical expertise. So I think from that end, at the end of the day, it's a colleague submitting a proposal in a shared area of expertise, right? So just like I want to receive the type of constructive feedback from my colleagues, right? I want to be mindful that I want to provide that type of feedback where we are intellectually engaging in a conversation of producing or developing this proposal. So I guess for me, it's like when I receive feedback like that, and it seems like they're raising questions for me to consider, right, in different sections, or reflecting on what they found, like, oh, this is really good, or I like this because you did XYZ, right? Maybe consider these type of questions or providing specific information. It makes me feel like I'm having an intellectual conversation with a colleague, right, who reviewed my work. So I would say that in the terms of thinking about sense of belonging.
Thank you for that. Anyone else want to weigh in on this question?
I can share something really quickly. I think when I think about sense of belonging and contributions being made, I really think about those who are newer to ASHE, some of our early career scholars, some of our graduate students, our doc students, and the way that this is really their introduction to what may be waiting for them on the other side of degree completion. And so it really sets the tone of like, where does my work fit in? If I'm doing work that may be on the margins or something not as widely seen or discussed just yet, is there a place for my work? Does my work fit in? Is it something that can be welcomed by other people in my field, by my peers in my field? And so again, I continue to think about disability, in particular, because that's a lot of what I do. Like, is that represented in the larger scheme of the work that we're all doing? Is ableism something that we're talking about? Systemic oppression are things that we're talking about. So sometimes I think it really helps to continue to push the work forward and to push the field forward at the same time. If we're also really exciting and bringing in other kinds of work that's not as on the forefront of what we might see every year when we go to ASHE.
Certainly, we are seeing a few themes connecting across even some of these questions, right? It makes me think some of the suggestions that were made earlier about not questioning the premises that somebody brings and the impact that it can have in how or whether or not we feel like the research that we are sharing with the field belongs. So I think that's really, really valuable. The next question kind of takes us to a different topic that I still think is very, very important. And considering, of course, that there is a particular format for works in progress, we are going to encounter, nevertheless, variations in terms of the completeness of findings in the proposals that we are encountering. So as a reviewer, how do you handle these variations in completeness as you're making your ratings and your recommendations? I wonder if for this one, we could perhaps start with Paul, and I certainly would invite any of our panelists to weigh in as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Gerardo. So I think this is always one of the challenges, right? Again, I'm going to sound like I'm repeating myself again because I am. You have 2,000 words, right? So like, what are you going to use those 2,000 words for? One of the changes that occurred this year with ASHE is that we now have a works in progress format. And the requirements for the works in progress format varied slightly from your traditional paper proposal submission. In particular, it was only 1,500 words, so apologies for those who needed those additional 500 words. But more importantly, said works in progress were expected to be works in progress. And so for those who did not submit in that format, the requirement was, rather than providing preliminary findings or full findings, which is a requirement for the research paper proposals, works in progress just asked for basically the importance or significance of the study to higher education more broadly. So I think keeping that in the back of your mind, one of the things that I have done historically is if that tends to be the stumbling block, maybe is the way to put this, of the proposal, I tend to explicitly say in the great qualitative comments to basically suggest, this might be a good option for a works in progress or for a poster. In some ways, provide, if the study itself has great promise, and that tends to be the one thing that currently doesn't exist, it could be actually beneficial for both the presenter as well as for the program committee themselves as they're trying to put together sessions, put together works in progress roundtables, which are not called rounds, I mean, but to put groups together, like they having additional options is never a bad thing. And I think putting those types of comments in is always super helpful. With that said, I think on the flip side of this, if you are reviewing a research paper proposal and there just aren't findings, like that is a limitation of the proposal itself, because that is a requirement for the submission. And I think that's the other side of the coin, right? Like that's the thing that you have to also keep in the back of your mind. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. It's really helpful to kind of tease apart these different components and how they influence our decisions as reviewers. Would anybody else like to add to these ideas? It is perfectly fine if we are covering, I think, a lot of the feedback on those. Angela?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I was just thinking, how do I handle this when I think this is an issue that often presents itself where the findings are either very preliminary or they're just sometimes aren't any. I loved Paul's comment about this year. We have the option of potentially saying, maybe this does fit better as a work in progress. But in the past, I've also sort of thought about what the author needs to do before November. Is that possible? A big question for me is always, do they have the data in their hands to do what they are saying, right? And if they do, I feel a lot better about the things. I know what I can accomplish between now and November, right? But if I don't have the data, that's a big unknown, I think, in terms of will the person be able to get the project done. So anyway, I was just thinking that as we're talking, Paul. I wanted to throw another question out that's somewhat related, and also another one I've encountered quite a bit as a reviewer. How do you handle it when the proposal might be outside of your expertise? And that could be that they are using a method you don't know much about, or it could be that you know this method really well, but this topic is not one that you have ever read much about or know too much about. So as a reviewer, how have the four of you handled those situations when it's a little bit outside of your expertise, or maybe quite a bit outside of your expertise? Cheryl, do you mind? Awesome. Thank you.
I can get us started. As you were talking, I was sort of reminded back to when Chris Wren gave her ASHE presidential address and kind of talking about high and low consensus fields. And we happen to be a low consensus field, meaning, and it's one of, I think, most days, I think it's one of the great things about our field of higher education. So you can have economists, political scientists, sociologists, humanist historians, like all, and people who don't identify with any of those, who identify by qualitative, quantitative, and there's like a home in higher ed, in our journals, including in our association. But of course, that then means that we kind of need to be slightly a jack of all trades. Possibly that also means that you will receive a proposal that you have maybe one angle into, but may not be able to then talk about the method. Or, I mean, I'm a qualitative researcher and I sometimes get quant pieces and I'm like, it's like Angela Boatman's world, like really heavy quant. And I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to say to this. But generally you're able to find something. So it might be a topic, right? So it's like, I know Angela and I, we studied dev ed reform. So it's like, well, maybe I can bring a qualitative lens to try and understand like what might be going on. So I may not be able to critique the method, but I may be able to say something about the lit review, the framing, research questions, the findings. Does this match up with what I've seen in the research that I've done? So that's kind of nice when you have topic, but not method, or sometimes you have method, but not topic, and you can kind of do something really similar. But if you have neither, then what are you going to go on, right? And I think I was like, I just then lean into the fact that like, I'm going to put on my hat of like, I'm an interested generalist, right? So I'll look for things like, is this clear? Like I have to be able to understand this. Like, I've got a doctorate too, right? I've been trained. I'm also in the research space. So if I'm not really getting what is being conveyed in these 2,000 words or 1,500 words, then maybe I can ask some questions about that. And that could then be useful for the author in terms of like, okay, you may need to add a little more, maybe this needs to be clearer, maybe this is a little too jargony and things need to be defined. So I think there's also things, because that is something that a project or a paper will be evaluated on, is whether and how you can communicate. You know, if you want to publish eventually in the Review of Higher Education, it does have to be for a general enough audience, like for higher ed. It's different than publishing in Econ of Ed, for example. So I think there are things that you can bring, even though you may not have topical or methodological expertise. You can ask questions about the significance of the topic for practice, for policy, even if you don't know the research and scholarly base as much. And I'm sure the other panelists have other kind of windows into this question too. So I will stop talking.
Thank you, Cheryl. Paul.
I'm going to give the advice and say, do as I say, not as I do. One of my big suggestions would be to read your proposal, the proposals that are assigned to you, as early as possible. Not necessarily that you go through the actual review process, but to figure out if the proposals that you were assigned are just so outside of what you know, that because then the option is that you can go and fill out the Google form to request a reassignment, or to go and connect with the conference committee to go and get it pulled from your review docket and move to someone else. Because full disclosure, like that is possible, right? And I think that the sort of related thing to this, which is not just even your like expertise, but it's like the conflict of interest comment, right? Like there are times when you can go, but strictly by the title, may say, oh yes, this is right up my alley. Then you get 2 sentences in and you're saying, I know exactly who wrote this. That has happened to me, I would say, a dozen times in the past 10 years, which is slightly terrifying. But in any event, through those so one of the things that I would say is read through what you've been assigned just to see if you fall into that situation, because I think one of the important things is to recognize there is a chance that you may be assigned something that you have absolutely no connection to, and it is 100% okay to say this is not in my wheelhouse at all, and that's why these sort of secondary processes exist.
In a slightly related vein, but I think it has to do more perhaps with our orientations and our ideas as scholars. And I think it's very important that we intentionally talk about those. But how do you manage proposals that may not align with your personal perspectives or views, or that may evoke perhaps a reaction? And I think increasingly, as we are studying topics that are polarized and polarizing, this could be a likely experience. So I wonder if our panelists would like to offer some perspectives on these.
I can start. So I think it's a little bit building on what Paul just mentioned. Maybe it's just a practice that I developed, but I always, when I get a batch of things to review, I try to look at the titles, right? And then typically title kind of give you a sense, because similar to Cheryl, I am a qualitative researcher, right? Not to say that I'm incapable of reviewing quantitative work, but I think for me, it's just knowing what I'm going to get into and then kind of like working backwards and schedule time to like review certain proposals, right? And there's been times where I have gotten proposals where I just have to take a step back and just like read or put it away for the day, right? And be mindful, all right, I may need more time to read this proposal and review it, right? So I just schedule it during a time there where I'm mentally and I could have more space for it. So I would say those are things that I've done in the past, try to like anticipate what I'm going to get myself into when it comes to reviewing like the types of proposals, but also maybe try to plan and when to review which proposals, if I feel like some may not align with the work that I do, or maybe in contrast to my perspectives or takes on areas that I study. That's what I would typically have done in the past.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to say, like we started in the beginning talking about how can we humanize this process for folks that we're reviewing for. But also it's important to remember, how do we humanize this experience for ourselves as reviewing, and what we're taking in and what kind of feedback we're giving out. And so similarly to what was mentioned before, perhaps maybe reaching out if you're able to identify a reviewer, if you're able to, if something that's completely out of your wheelhouse. Also really important to take a step back, to sit with it when you're able to, and really think about giving, and this is just my suggestion, unemotional feedback, really looking at it and looking at the black and white of what's written and how can you take that and give constructive feedback, but also humanizing it for yourself. And if it's really something that may give you pause, maybe reach out and seek some support in asking if reassignment is even possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these perspectives. I think in the spirit of humanizing the review process for reviewers, it also merits to mention that we are never, like, the decision is never on our shoulders alone. Every proposal that comes through has been assigned to 3 reviewers, right? So certainly it's not our responsibility alone to make a decision about it. And I think it's also important to recognize that there will be different perspectives and that sometimes we will also make mistakes as reviewers. And I think that's an important component in these roles. Cheryl, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think there was, ASHE is so well organized. So we got like little highlights of what was mentioned like in the previous year's feedback. And there was something that caught my eye at one point, and I realized that I don't know if it's like come up yet unless I've missed it, but I think it's actually also sometimes useful and potentially welcomed in the qualitative comments to actually be explicit about how you're coming to the review, right? So taking what I think is a fairly benign example, it's like, so if I was given like a regression discontinuity project to read, I'm like, okay, I think I kind of know the premise like of what an RD is, but I can't like unpack all the technicalities. So I'll say like, I'm reviewing this as someone who is trained qualitatively, who understands like the concept of an RD, but doesn't offer or cannot offer like the kind of technical expertise that you might need. So you might need to get that from someone else who has all of that. And hopefully one of the other reviewers can provide that. I don't think I've done, I'll have to admit, I'm not sure I've done that like in ASHE proposals, but I've certainly done that in journal reviews. Just being really honest about like, how I'm reviewing, and particularly when it comes to methodology, because there are just some things that I can't. And so, I mean, maybe even thinking like kind of, so I'd say I kind of like add that. And then just really to echo like what's said is that, I mean, sometimes, just like with writing, kind of know the times of days that really work for you to take in people's work and to be, I think, generous in your feedback to them. I do know that if I write a review and it's like late at night and I just want to get it done, it doesn't really work out very well, and I was like, maybe take a pause, like write it, draft it, and then the next day return to it and clean up all the sharp edges, from your language, but still maintaining the, the more kind of developmental and the questions that you want to impart to the authors.
Thank you. This was going to be my last question. Cheryl, you kicked it off perfectly, but I wanted to ask each of the panelists, and Gerardo, do you have any thoughts as well? Just we have a lot of first-time reviewers that are on the webinar, and we've heard a lot of great like practical tips. Like Paul, I loved the read the whole proposal before you start writing comments. I think that's great advice. Cheryl, you just offered some great advice about, do this at a time when you're actually in a place to be generous and thoughtful with your feedback. Other tips, anything else that you think you would recommend to someone sitting down with 5 or so proposals they have to review? Any advice, other tips you would give them?
My big tip, they each, especially if you've never done this before, it will take much longer than you think it's going to. I remember the first, like, I shouldn't say just the first year, probably the first couple of years that I reviewed for ASHE. I remember I waited until the last day. I'm both type A and a horrible procrastinator. This is also why I was saying, do as I say, not as I do. In any event, 100%, I spent so much longer than I had expected to get the 7, 8, however many there were that you're done. If you split them over a couple of days, your life will be much easier. That would be my big piece of advice.
Thank you, Paul. I could not agree more. To say, do as I say, not as I necessarily do. Ramon.
Yeah, similar, it might be a repetition, but I think the advice that I'll give myself and give for first-time reviewers, if I was reviewing for the first time again, will be like, provide the feedback that you would like to receive. When I mean by that, like constructive feedback, right? I always think about like, when I write something and I reread it to myself, like, is this something one that makes sense if it was given to me, but also does it make also is helpful for my development in this section or overall proposal? So I would say be mindful and thoughtful, and it aligns with what Paul was saying, kind of like trying to review it ahead of time versus waiting to the end, because less time, more stress, and then you'll probably move a little bit too quick, right? So I would say do that in addition to what Paul was saying.
Thank you. Cheryl, one last one, and then we'll kick it back to Angela for some logistics.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, this is less a tip for reviewers, but maybe like on receiving the review. And so I remember, it was in grad school, like I had a professor that basically set up like a peer review system, like for our class papers. And that was like a really great introduction to like what this thing would all be about, peer reviewing, whether it's for conferences or journals and such. I remember one of the pieces of advice that he gave was that, when you receive the review, read it and then put it away. Because sometimes like there could be things that are not like, even if they're constructive, like sometimes in the moment, like you may not feel that they're super constructive, right? So I think this just kind of echoes like some of the advice that's been provided here in terms of giving reviews. On receiving reviews, it's like, there could also just be moments where you're more open to hearing the questions that really kind of are pushing, I think even in a developmental way, but sometimes like it can still be heard as, an attack potentially like on my project. And so I think there is like a sense of, maybe I think read it just to kind of get a gist of what it is, put it away. And when you're kind of ready to engage it, whether it's a positive, like great, it's been accepted and now I've got stuff to work on, or like in Kat's earlier example, like, it's like, okay, maybe it wasn't accepted, but there's something really useful here that I can use and maybe turn it around for AERA or AFP or, next ASHE, right? Like there always are going to be opportunities to take your projects forward. But it's also, hopefully if reviewers do their good job, then like all the reviews are really quality and done in good spirit. And then it becomes like what happens like when you receive them and like what do you do with them, and being able to hear the reviews is really important.
And with a huge word of gratitude to all of our panelists for sharing their experiences, I'm really happy to turn it over to our colleague Angela, who will give us some of the specifics as to how to enter all this one and how to put all these wonderful good practices into action.
Thank you so much, Gerardo. Thank you so much, Angela Boatman, and all of our panelists for sharing your perspectives on a high quality peer review process. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Also want to thank you all for your great questions in the chat. I have been chatting back answers while our panelists have been speaking. So if you want to open your Q&A window, I believe under the answered questions, you can always go back and see the other questions I've been addressing as we've been going along. And I think many of our panelists touched on answers related to those as well. All right, so to start off here, you all should have received a reviewer assignment email that looked something like this. It has the link to the conference portal where you will go to complete your reviews. It has a reminder that reviews are due on May 30th at 4 p.m. Central Minneapolis time, so keeping that date in mind. That leaves you this weekend, next weekend to get these complete through the holiday weekend. And again, hopefully you're not having to spend all of your weekend doing these, but having the weekend, a couple of weekends as an option, or of course during the week, depending on what your work life sort of looks like. And of course we have as a resource, this session today. As I mentioned, the session is recorded. It will be available over on this reviewer resources webpage, probably by Monday, midday, if you wanted to go back and watch any pieces of this. And we will make sure that our reviewers that weren't able to join today's session are aware that that resource exists out there as well. As noted in this email, and I think as our panelists spoke to, we really encourage you to, on the sooner end of sooner than later, to really log into the system, take a look at those titles, do a skim through of the proposals to make sure that there's no red flags on the front end. And if there are, submitting this reviewer mismatch and conflict of interest form, which I will pull up here. On this form, this is where you can submit proposals where, let's say you have a situation like Paul mentioned, where you're like, I have a 99, 95, 90% chance that I know who this proposal's from because gosh, this work just sounds so familiar to me. I know my colleague down the hall is working on this. I know my graduate student is working on this. Please, if you can identify who the submitter is, please put in this conflict of interest form so we can get that reassigned and really protect the quality and integrity of this process. This form can also be used if you are assigned a proposal that just feels really out of left field for you. So the program committee, whenever possible, really tried to take a look at folks' focus areas, methodology areas, and match you that way. So you may have a proposal that aligns with a methodology you said you were familiar with, but maybe you're not familiar with the content. Or maybe you are familiar with the content, but not the method. That's okay. That's still an alignment for you to review. And then there are times where you may just be sort of the generalist on the proposal. Each proposal does get 3 reviews. And the aim is really that one of those reviewers at minimum has a knowledge focus area, one has a method focus area, and the third can be sort of a generalist approach. Maybe it's something you're not as familiar with, but you could still really offer helpful feedback on that proposal from that perspective. Maybe you will bring different questions to that proposal because it is an area you're less familiar with. You would submit this form if it just really feels like, gosh, I am not going to have something to offer on this proposal because it is really out of my area of knowledge. And then we can work on getting it reassigned. So again, kind of giving it that thoughtful consideration. Can I review this from a generalist perspective, a methods perspective, or a knowledge perspective? And if not, go ahead and submit this form. So that's a little bit about that process. And then also in this email is linked our conference portal guide for reviewers, which I have open here. And it outlines all of the review criteria for all of the different proposal types. So I would recommend before beginning reviews, perhaps you ground yourself really in these review criteria. You will find that there are notes of, oh, there's certain criteria that don't apply to certain types. And so as you go to complete your reviews, you're going to want to pay attention to what proposal type you're reviewing and remind yourself things like, as I think Paul reminded us and several others, Cheryl, I believe as well, that works in progress, for example, should not be evaluated on findings. And it's not even going to be something that shows up on your rubric for you to evaluate, but reminding yourself as you go into that review that, oh yeah, I'm not looking for findings on this one. I'm looking for all of these other pieces. Did they connect to the literature? Did they connect to the theoretical framework? And there's a few other examples like that where an interactive symposium is really focused on discussion and interaction within a session, not on one single particular study. So of course that session type is not evaluated on study design. So taking the time to not only engage in thoughtful review, but making sure that you're reviewing through this guide and that you're grounding yourself sort of properly before engaging your reviews. And in that email is a link to all of these resources on the reviewer resource webpage, which again has that reviewer guide I just showed you. It'll have the webinar recording. It will have additional resources about peer review. There's a journal article and a few other things in there around why review processes matter, why peer review matters. And then I believe Paul referenced this as well, the examples of constructive and reliable and unconstructive reviews. These are not actual reviews that were delivered to people. These were reviews that were created for exemplar purposes. And so encourage you to check out those to, again, kind of get a sense of, oh yes, what does a quality review actually look like? We can talk about it all day, but sometimes seeing those examples can be really helpful. So when you are ready to go and complete your reviews, you're going to go in your assignment email, and it has the link to this portal. It is the same portal where if you submitted a proposal, you would have submitted your proposal through. So you're going to select to log in. You're going to enter your ASHE membership credentials, the same ones you would be using to log in on, say, our ASHE website. If you need assistance resetting your password, you can contact our office at ashe.ws email, and we're happy to help with that. Another reason why it's important to start your reviews early, log into the system early, so that it's not like proposal submission day, perhaps, where some folks are submitting day of and realizing, oh my gosh, I can't get into the system. I don't know my password. And that can happen on the review end too. So we do recommend trying to log in, early, take a look at those titles and all of that, make sure that things are working properly. So when you log in, you're going to now have this reviewer menu, which is where you will be able to go in and view your reviews that you have been assigned. This is just a sort of test on my end here, but you can see, for example, that I may have been assigned reviews in 3 different sections. And so I have a couple different areas pop up, but I actually only have 1 review left to complete. And so how many reviews you have left to complete, you'll know by looking to pending. When your reviews are done, this number should be 0. If it's not 0, it means you didn't actually complete them all. You didn't maybe submit something, maybe you just saved it. So I'm going to go in here under context for that section, because I know I do have a review there. And it clarifies, oh, I have 1 review pending. And this is the proposal I have been assigned. And I'm going to select review. But before I do that, one thing I want to point out is right now I'm under individual presentations. You want to make sure that you're also checking under sessions, because there are 2 different ways that folks can submit proposals. They can submit as a, say, 15-minute proposal that'll be lumped in with other proposals to present at the conference to complete a full session. So 3 research papers put together, for example. I might just submit a single research paper. Program committee will be responsible for placing me with other papers for a full 75-minute session. While other types, like an interactive symposium, a self-designed paper session, those are going to be full sessions. And so you want to make sure, in this case, I am not assigned any sessions to review, but you might be. And so you want to check under there. And that would be a reason why maybe your number is showing as pending and you still have 1 to do. It could be that you forgot to toggle these tabs. But I just have my 1 individual presentation that I need to review. I'm going to select review. There are additional guiding instructions here, a reminder about sort of our 5-point scale. What constitutes a 1 versus a 5? Does the proposal not cover it at all? I think there was a question about what happens if there was supposed to be findings and there's not any, not even preliminary findings. Well, that would then get it at 1 point because it omits that piece. Versus 5 points, the proposal really meeting that criteria. I believe some of our panelists pointed out that typically for a proposal to be accepted, there's an average of around a 4. And so thinking about that as you're completing your reviews, if you're really feeling like, gosh, this is something that should be accepted, well, your ratings should really reflect that. And cross-checking that. If you're finding your ratings are really around 2s and 3s, well, thinking a little bit more about, is this a proposal then that should be accepted? Do I either need to adjust my ratings to align with that? Or do my ratings really tell the true story of maybe this proposal needs some additional work? I have the title of my proposal over here. I can expand this. And I want to pay attention to what the type is. So it's a scholarly paper intended to be presented in person. My authors are masked, as they should be. If the only ones that they should display for is interactive symposiums, those do not need to be masked because who those individuals are maybe a factor in accepting that proposal. What is their experience with that particular topic area? But all others should be masked. And if it's not for some reason, please email conference so we can take care of that and get that proposal also reassigned so we can maintain that masked review process. I'm going to want to make sure I'm reading through, as our panelists suggested, reading through the full proposal. And then my criteria and ratings are over here. And the criteria will display that align with that proposal type. So if this was a works in progress, findings would not even be a criteria I'm supposed to be rating on. It would just not even show up. But in this case, it is for scholarly papers. And so I would go through and remark my values of what I think this is, with a reminder that 1 is on that lower end of that scale and 5 is considered excellent. I can make comments to the association. Maybe I think that this proposal is better suited for another section. Maybe I want to offer additional explanation for why I rated the way I did. That's something that really the program committee needs to see, but not necessarily the author. And then for the author, I want to make sure I'm offering 50-word reflection on why I rated it the way that I did, areas that I think they could improve, journals I might suggest that they publish this work in. Some of those types of things. And I think several of our panelists talked about the ratings are great. We want to make sure that the ratings reflect our actual thoughts on the proposal, but we want more than just the number. We need to know why you rated it the way that you did and what your suggestions for improvement are. That's really the crux of the peer review process, is what did you like about it? What was great? What do you want to celebrate about this? What questions do you still have? Offering those comments is what's going to help move this work forward and also help folks really see their work in the field of higher education, see their work at ASHE. And again, even if it is not accepted, I think our panelists reflected some of maybe the best reviews they received were sometimes proposals that needed some additional development and work, and that feedback helped move it forward so they could resubmit in a future year or submit it for publication as a further developed piece down the line. And then you'll offer your final decision. Again, maybe looking back at your ratings and saying, well, gee, do I have an average of sort of 4 happening here? If yes, then okay, I probably want to mark accept. Is it below that? And giving some thoughtful consideration. And you might be able to offer, I mark this as accept, but it really has an average of 3, but I just think that this work is really important. Or I just question whether or not their preliminary findings will be fully developed in time for the conference. And being able to then let the program committee make the final decision on that. Some of you asked, what if I need additional support in doing these reviews? You are welcome to reach out to conference@ashe.ws if you have additional questions as you're reviewing, you want support, and we can get you connected with the program section chairs for some additional support in talking through your reviews, if that would be helpful for you. Also, there were some questions in the chat about what happens if reviewers offer sort of disparate feedback. A couple people say this is a 4 and should be accepted, and one person saying this is a reject, and it's an average of a 2. The section chairs look at all of the feedback in making their final decisions and pay particular attention to those ones that have some disparate feedback, to really take another look at it, even invite program committee chairs, the co-chairs, Angela and Gerardo, into the conversation to sort of take another look at these and sort of see what's going on there and where that feedback was sort of coming from. And so know that these are given a lot of attention and are essentially sort of reviewed multiple times, not only by reviewers, but also by that feedback then being further reviewed by the section chairs. The last thing I'll mention is you do want to make sure that you select complete review when you are done and select accept and continue. Once you do that, you cannot go back and reopen your review. It is final at that point. So many individuals like to go through and do save work and maybe finish later until they complete all of their reviews and can take one more look through and then say, okay, I want to complete my review. But do make sure you do actually complete your review. If not, we can't just necessarily go in and submit it for you. And so it is really important that by that May 30th deadline, you go in and complete your review. And with that, I believe I have covered all of the information that I need to today. There is a chance some of you may be assigned additional reviews as time goes on over the next week, as some of those conflict of interest come through. And if that happens, we will reach out to you by email to say, hey, check your portal. You were assigned a couple more, or maybe you weren't assigned originally, and now you are. And with that, I think we have wrapped up our time together today. Thank you for hanging in there just a few extra minutes as we covered our logistics. And if you have any questions, again, please don't hesitate to reach out to conference@ashe.ws. and we can get you some additional support or answer your questions there. And another round of gratitude and thank you to our program committee co-chairs, Angela and Gerardo, and our wonderful panelists from our program and conference committee. Thanks so much and have a great rest of your day.